So you want answers? You want the truth? I think you can handle it. Everybody except for Dan. He can't handle it.
I can't handle the truth.
All right. Today we bring in an expert in to reveal the real story of the inch pincher. Now, you may have seen an earlier show with Peter Kaplan as he talked about this famous race VW bug. Well, that wasn't why he was on the show, but his story certainly got the most attention. And some folks say the story about the inch pincher isn't completely accurate, and there's still too many unanswered questions about what happened to it. So we did some digging and found a guest who will clear the air once and for all. All right, so welcome to West of Tulsa. This is a controversial show. Or actually, it's meant to settle a controversy. Yes. How's that? Yes. All right. So when Peter was on, not long ago,
yes,
he started this.
My apologies.
Yeah, Peter started all this. We're gonna get to all that in a second. But Dean Kirsten, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, guys.
Yeah. So Dean, to give you a little bit of background, with Hot VW magazine for 40 years,
right?
You're a writer, photographer. Now you're kind of a historian, but you're almost your whole life has been with Hot VW Mag.
It's about the only job I ever actually had. I never filled a job application or take, heaven forbid, a drug test in my whole life.
And luckily, we don't provide them here, right?
No drug test.
I think we'd all fail. Yeah. You don't want to know. Oh, no, we don't want to know. Dean, thank you for coming. You came in all the way from San Diego, North County, San Diego, to talk.
Right. And wasn't bad.
Resolve this issue.
No, it's one of my favorite subjects, so I'm all in on it.
All right. You're the perfect guy to have in here.
Okay.
All right. And then Peter Kaplan.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So Peter, fine art, automotive
Thank you.
photographer. Is that a good way? He's an artist. Does amazing work. And when you were on the show before, it was to talk about how you would just open up the studio, and then you had to go open up your big mouth and talk about the inch pincher.
So, I mean, if you guys remember the show, I basically felt like I owed it to your audience to explain why I got into automotive anything in the first place. Because I'm not a car person, really. I don't have a history in any of this. But I literally, like I said, I met this guy who was a neighbor of mine who had this crazy car collection and basically turned me onto the story of the inch pincher. And he believed that he had the actual car that had, in his mind, had been missing since 1969. And so, like I said, at the end of the show, I was like, hey, I want to tell you guys an interesting story. And that's kind of how the whole thing happened.
Well, also, too, the guy that you were talking about, Blasé McFadden, right?
Yes.
He's somewhat of a local legend as
for
well.
Sure is,
whether positive or negative, there's lots of people with all kinds of stories about him.
You might say he's infamous.
Infamous, exactly, infamous. Yeah. So that in itself was interesting, at least in the local Ventura community, VW community, but then the inch pincher itself just kind of blossomed into this much bigger story.
Well, and if I may say, like it's interesting because like your comment section, I would say, was exactly what I discovered the day I met Blaze. I met him in like it wasn't that long ago. I mean, I met him in like 2020, I think. That's when I met him, and it was like and he told me this whole story about this car known as the inch pincher. I knew nothing about it, and he's like, "You want to see? I got this car back here. You want to see it?" And he takes me back and pulls the dusty cover off the thing, and I get to see the thing for the first time. Really cool car. Dean knows the car, and he tells me this wild story about how it's like missing, and it's like the biggest scandal in the NHRA history. All these sorts of things, and I'm just like, I don't know what to think, and I'm aware of this guy's kind of reputation and how it's generally not like the most shining, example of reputation. So I was like, man, I don't know if I believe anything that this guy's saying. And so I went home and I Googled it, and instantly I come across like the Samba, and it's, and only like in the last few years, and people are like angry with each other about, and just arguing and calling each other names and being like really like nasty on the internet. And I was like, whoa, there's like something very inflammatory about this. There's something very like, it felt like something that was, like an open wound that people were still like dealing with. And so I was like, wow, that's fascinating. And so in my mind, I was like, well, whether it's the car or not, this is a really interesting story to kind of jump into. And that night, like I bought my first camera package that night just to tell this story. I bought like a Blackmagic, and bought all this gear and mics and stuff just so I could tell this story.
Yeah.
And, I spent a couple years essentially, going down this path. But it's interesting because Blaze, he would talk about Dean because he had great respect for Dean and in his position in the VW community and those sorts of things. But he was not. He would talk about Dean as someone that you wanted to avoid because his version of the story of the inch pincher did not match up with what Blaze is.
Okay.
And then I would just say after the show happened, I was on the show last time and I got all this attention. He reached out to me and he was really gracious and we talked for like an hour and it was so cool and he gave me some information that I had just never had and I was very curious. Since the day I learned about it, I've just been curious about what really happened. And you look online and people swear that many different things happened to it. And so well, what really happened? I have no stake in this. Like, if the car is not the car, it doesn't really matter. It's still an interesting story. So anyway, that's, I think, why.
And you were just telling Blaze's version of what he
sure.
told you. That was it.
And that's one of the things, because in the comment section, you have people literally comment after comment contradicting what the last person just said, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So this is why I love this show, because we get to talk about this stuff. And it's, you don't have to believe your story. You don't have to believe Blaze's story. You don't have to believe Dean's story. But we're just going to tell it, and it's up to you to decide what you want to do. People are like, you need to educate people more with facts. I'm like, how do you know that's a fact? You can't Google this stuff. So we're just saying, hey, these are the people's stories. That's all they're doing. Take it for what it's worth.
Well, let's get the facts.
Yeah, let's get them.
Let's get them.
Let's
we got
do
the
this.
guy here, right?
Okay.
You've been listening. Did we make you nervous with all this controversy? No. Okay, good.
Heck no.
You've probably seen a lot of this and heard about a lot of this over the years.
I didn't follow the back talk of it, but I can imagine just following Samba over the years that it does get vicious.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Your name came up because you mentioned that. I was like, why does that name sound familiar? I went back to the comments and there were people that was like, hey, who knows something about this? Dean Kirsten.
Yeah.
So I was just like, oh, well, let's get him on,
Yeah.
So you must be somebody.
Yeah. 40 years at Hot VW Magazine.
Right.
You should know a little bit about this car, I would imagine. So,
well, I remember the car as far back as '66, actually watching it at the drags, and so that was the impression that I had, and it's stayed with me all these years, like so many other car guys. And I met Darrell probably 72 or 73, Darrell Vittone, 72 or 73, and Dean Lowry I met, and I've known them over the years until they both passed away. And so it's by far the most iconic Volkswagen in the VW industry, probably next to Herbie, which really never existed.
Yeah.
But so there's a lot of the industry was built around that car and followed what they did with that car.
So let's start with the easiest question. So the bug that Blaze showed Peter a few years ago was not the inch pincher.
No.
Or was it?
I just don't think it any way possible that it could be. Blaze's story created this second car that I don't think ever existed. The inch pincher morphed through many changes over the years, specifically in the end of '69, when Darrell Vittone took it and put a different body on it. So the old body went to Mexico, and the new body ended up in New Jersey over a period of time. So to have the car back together in all steel just didn't make sense to me. It just didn't add up to the history that I thought really happened.
But you said the car that he does have is still an important automobile, right?
Right. So the car that Blaze has is a 56 VW Bug, or the body show, which is the same year as the original inch pincher was. So that part of it makes sense. When I saw it in 2005, it's a full steel car. Nothing's been cut out of it. It is on a different floor pan or chassis, which I thought is interesting, the fact that in '69, the body and chassis were separated and went into two different directions. So I find that interesting. Blaze's car is all steel on, I don't even know what year pan it is. And for it to be...
I think it's like the next 50 to 64 pan.
Okay, right. And it's easy to do on a Volkswagen, to flip pans. For it to be the inch pincher, it would have to have been dating back to, I would say, 65, maybe 66, before the inch pincher started changing body parts to fiberglass, cutting body parts out, replacing with aluminum. So it would have had to have dated back to that period of time in order for his story to make sense.
Right. Agreed.
All right. So it sounds like at some point, inch pincher is kind of parted out in some sense.
You could say that.
Okay. Tell us what you kind of just touched on it, but give us some direction. Literally, what direction did these parts go in?
Well, I think it'd be cool too to just say so the car originally, and you probably know this history, but like when it was traded into Econo Motors,
Right.
in like early
59.
Okay, 59. Okay, and it had like a huge amount of miles on it.
The reported Joe Vittone always would say that the car had over 200,000 miles on it. So you think a 56 VW bought new in 56, let's say, and by 59 it had 200,000 miles on a 36 horse Volkswagen. I mean, that's a serious amount of miles. Yeah. So that was the story it was always told. So it came in. Joe Vittone owned Econo Motors, which is Darrell's father, in Riverside. This car came in as a trade-in in 59. And Darrell's 16th birthday was in March of 1960. And the story goes that was a birthday present. So I'm sure they cleaned it up, they repainted it orange, and that became Darrell's street car from 1960 on. So that's the bones of this story. It was Darrell's car.
And that was the beginning of inch pincher?
No, this would predate the inch pincher.
This would predate, but that would become what would become the inch pincher.
And then I think another thing that I find important about this, so EMPI, E-M-P-I, so correct me if I'm wrong, Dean, but I believe it used to mean European Motor Parts Incorporated or...
Engineered parts.
Well, in the beginning, and then what I understood is when Dean came in, because he was an engineer, then they changed it to engineer.
That's right. I think, 62, maybe 64, somewhere around there. They changed the name.
Totally. Yeah. And Dean Lowry, who he's a very storied person himself, but he was an engineer essentially, and he used to rate, I guess, flathead V8s.
Yes.
And so when they brought him into MP, Joe Vittone did, and he basically came in and started doing like R&D stuff. He started inventing parts, and so my friend Blaze. He just, Dean Lowry was like the king of the car world in his mind. He had so much respect for him and all the parts that he created for MP. And in his mind, he was basically the godfather of the entire like tuning kind of communities. Like before him, no one sold aftermarket performance parts. Like no one was really doing that. MP was kind of the first one, and it's actually really fascinating because I guess Volkswagen wasn't really cool with them doing this. Like that, and they sent him like cease and desist and that sort of thing. But Joe Vittone had Econo Motors all across the country, and so they like kind of tried this thing. Okay, well we'll not send you cars, and then we'll basically stop this before it really becomes a thing. But he sold so many cars that they actually started hurting themselves by like trying to not let
shoot yourself in the foot.
Well, right. So then I guess we'll just turn a blind eye and let MP just kind of do their thing. And so anyway, I think that was a fascinating part of me to me about the whole history of it. And then this whole thing of Darrell Vittone getting the car when he's 16. And he's hanging around. I'm sure he's hanging around Dean Lowry when he's working on these cars. And the way I understood it was this car's just there. And, Dean's inventing parts, doing all these sorts of things. And they just start bolting them on this car eventually. And like, it, kind of becomes more and more modified and becomes not what the inch pincher were to become as a drag car. It became like a Grand Prix, like race car, like a long distance, like car. Is how you describe it? In
63 and 64, the car was taken to the Bahamas and it was ran in a NASA Grand Prix. And
driven by, was that AJ Foyt or is it Dan Gurney?
Dan Gurney.
Dan Gurney.
Oh,
yes.
wow.
Nice.
That's impressive, yeah.
And he won.
He won it 2 years in a row, but the second year they disqualified him because they put shims under the valve springs, and they said that was illegal. As if that would make a difference.
Wow.
But you thought, Dan Gurney, we're talking like royalty when it comes to racing. And so he races this thing, and before it becomes like what is known as the inch pincher, the drag car, which is so fascinating. And then I think, the way the story was told to me was that Joe Vittone, I think, kind of like got the wind knocked out of his sails. He's like, I don't know if I really, we're kind of, I guess we got disqualified. Let's not really do it. And from what I was told, like Dean was like, no, like let's like drag race this thing. And they start, and he was a real, like, he was a head guy, right? I mean, he was a dyno like expert.
Right. They actually created a dyno for MP Sutska dyno up in Colorado. Joe Vittone approached him, says, we would like to have and sell a dynamometer a flywheel dyno just for Volkswagen. So they actually developed a dyno, and so Dean had maybe up around 64, maybe had his own dyno, which was unheard of at the time.
Wow. Well, one thing I'm getting out of this is you've done your research.
Yeah,
Well, hey,
Yes.
man, I'm not.
So you were on the show.
Yeah, you can't say you can't say you don't know anything because you know
Man.
quite a bit.
No, no.
At least today you do.
No, I knew all this stuff when I was on the show before, but like I said, I spent like multiple years kind of like getting into this, and my only source of real information was Blaze, who by many accounts was kind of like off his rocker in many ways. So he was the guy was. Despite his many idiosyncrasies, he was like the guy was a genius. I mean, I think if you would have put him in a different industry, the guy could have been like an unbelievable genius. He had a mind like a steel trap. I mean, like that's why I had so much fun with him, because I'd walk in his shop and it was like this unbelievable. Did you ever see his shop?
No, I never went there.
I mean, it was, just like this unbelievably curated museum. I remember the first time I'm with my daughter. I think I told this story on the show, but she's like just over a year old, and he like rolls back the door for the first time, and it took my breath away. I mean, I couldn't believe how beautiful this place was, and just like the memorabilia, just the history that was there.
Did you document this?
Oh yeah, no, I've yeah.
Oh, we got to see that.
Well, I figured I wanted to show you guys too, because I actually my documentary I thought was going to be like an hour and a half or something, and when he passed, just because I was trying to like. I was still kind of managing the car and what was happening with it. But I was like, I don't like, this isn't my story. Like, I have no stake in this. So I cut together like a 15-minute long thing that I'll show you guys. It has some of the footage of his shop when it was
sweet.
in all of its glory.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
So anyway, he was a very fascinating person. And like I said, the first time I saw the car, it was in this room that was built on the side of his shop. And, the entire wall was covered. It looked like a crime scene, like like pins, between pictures and stuff. But it was literally like hundreds of magazine clippings and photographs and all these sorts of things. And like in his mind, kind of the evidence, kind of what the car, the history of the car, and like pictures of, for instance, of the car when it was just a 56 oval window was traded back in. And then pictures of it in Nassau, and pictures of it, when it was actually racing and beating all these famous race cars and all these sorts of different things. So anyway, I'm rambling now, but that's essentially, I did my research.
Yeah.
But I didn't get to talk to Dean, who, and people like that. And like, I tried to go to the Schley Museum. I reached out to them multiple times, and nothing ever really happened.
Oh.
And whatever, it is what it is. But I really wanted to find the real story. And to be totally honest, and I guess I want to say this, Blaze, I mean, if you were to approach him on the street and be like, you got the inch pincher, you don't have the inch pincher, like he would probably try to fight you. But but in private, he wasn't like super confident. I mean, he'd be like, man, maybe it's not the car. Maybe this is wrong. Maybe I've got this wrong. Like he definitely had that thought. And his end, the demise, him, taking his own life. I feel like that was part of it, was it wrapped up in him kind of feeling like this thing he had spent all this time and kind of staked his reputation on was maybe not true. And so anyway, that's.
But you're working on a documentary on all this.
Well, I was. Yes.
I was about to say, I'd love to see that.
Well,
you're kind of unraveling your documentary here, so it's good.
No, I mean that's honestly why I wanted to do this show, because I was like, I basically, when I first met this guy, he's like, hey, well, will you tell this story? And I was like, that seems like a big responsibility, but like I said, I went home and Googled it, and I was like, wow, this is a really cool opportunity, and I was looking for a cool story to tell.
Yeah.
So I felt like I wanted to see that through the end, and I'm bummed that he's no longer with us, and he can't, be able to find out what really happened and be able to celebrate his car for what it is, because it's an amazing car. Yeah. But that's why I was excited to kind of be on this show, because I never really knew what I was going to do with the documentary. I didn't know who I was going to show it to. I didn't know how any of that stuff was going to happen. I knew people in the VW community would instantly blackball it, because they were like, "Oh, this guy's crazy. He's a and they would just instantly not trust it." So,
but they'd go watch it.
They probably would. Yeah. So anyway,
they would definitely watch it.
But I think that this to me was like, oh, well, that's really cool. Like this can be like, here it is. It all comes to a head, and we can sit down with Dean, someone that actually really knows and has done his research. I've done a little bit of research in the grand scheme of things, and be fun to just kind of tell the world what, really happened. So.
No, I think it's cool, because I actually did some asking around with the local guys here in town, and their comments on Blaze was not as favorable
Well, no, I mean, I literally watched him chase people physically off his property like multiple times.
Well,
I mean, that's
one
like,
of my buddies who knew him, I guess, off and on throughout the years, could have sworn that I knew he stole tools out of my work truck. I knew he did. I was
it's possible. It's possible.
I heard that one too. Yeah.
And I guess I should say, like, I think the very fact that I wasn't a car person was the only reason he trusted me.
Oh yeah, sure.
If I had been a car person, if I had any like smell of a person that had any interest in VW, I would have been just
He
like
probably thought you were
else.
trying to like shiest him for
Yeah,
parts
but I had no
whatever.
interest in any of his stuff. I was interested in him. I was just like, he's just like this fascinating character, and I was just like, and I will say this, like, I've been a photographer, videographer for my entire career, and he's the only person you could stand here like 2 feet away from him with a camera, and he would not change at all, like literally none. And so it was so fascinating. He just opened his life to me, and he didn't to anyone. So I just walk around his shop with a camera and shoot everything. And I'd shoot all the stuff that like, no one was allowed to see, and him, in all these different states. And I mean, it was an amazing experience.
How long was it from when you started shooting and documenting this stuff until he killed himself?
Well, that happened last February, and then I started in 2020. So it was like, 2 and a half years.
Oh, wow.
Something like that. 2.5 years. Yeah.
So I wonder if he knew, like, he was just like, I want to tell my story before I'm gone.
Well, I don't really know, but I guess I did have some guilt about that. I was like, man, I really just wanted to kind of like, vindicate him or vindicate his story, which I would say like so much of his story was actually true. So much of it was actually really cool. And, he operated really out of this like insane respect for Dean Lowry, not Dean Kirsten, Dean Lowry. I'm sorry, dude.
Not Dean Kirsten.
No, but he like, to him, that guy had been dealt a bad card by like the car industry. He felt like, and once again, I don't know anything about this, but he felt like Joe Vittone had kind of like screwed Dean over in the long term, and that was kind of his estimation. And he was like, hey, like, he's like, I think Dean Lowry's responsible, like you said, like for the entire tuning kind of industry. It's like no one really, made aftermarket performance parts until him. Yeah. And Empey basically got to take the credit for all of his inventions and all of those sorts of things that really pushed forward the VW kind of motor and all these different things that they could do with them. And so that was really his impetus. And he had this car for many years before he even like started to get this idea that it was the inch pincher. I mean, he had it, he bought it in 90, I believe, from a person that I think you knew Bob, right? Bob McGinnis.
I knew of him, but not personally, no.
Yeah. So anyway, Bob was a guy, he's just a few blocks from here is where his shop was. And that's where Blaze originally saw it. But he went on to be kind of like the right-hand man for Magnuson Superchargers. Oh, yeah. This guy,
right.
Bob.
Yeah. Right.
And he passed away just last year. And actually when my buddy Blaze passed, a couple months later, I get this call from this guy named Bob, who was the one that sold the car to him originally. And I learned some really fascinating things from Bob about the car. Like we talked about on the phone, which we could talk about here. But anyway, I'm getting lost in my.
Did Bob think it was the inch pincher?
No, he actually.
Okay, I was about to say.
No, Bob was adamant that it wasn't, and he wanted to fight Blaze about it because Blaze was like, hey, like I think there was one point, and there's a guy down the street here. His name's Craig, who's a great guy. He's a super respected upholstery guy. Like he's done a bunch of like Pebble Beach winning Porsches and that sort of thing. He primarily only does 356 Porsches. And anyway, he knew both of those people, and he had a shop right next to both of them back in the 80s and whatnot. And he was there the day that Blaze shows up to Bob and like confronts him. He's like, "You're lying about this car. Like, this is actually the inch pincher." And like he said, they like almost physically fought. Like it was like this crazy thing. And so
that's crazy.
Anyway, it's like a nuts. The whole thing is. Blaze, I will say, like he founded one of the most infamous gangs here in Ventura. I mean, he's like the guy had a very storied past, and so he was not a person that you really wanted to like mess with. So anyway, so I think Bob didn't have a very high view of him, which I think a lot of people shared that opinion. But anyway.
Yeah, based in the comments section, it was like there was enough to say, this guy's always talking about it. He doesn't have the inch pincher,
but it is fascinating too, because like Craig, the guy who was there that knew both of them, he's like, man, I think Blaze's story is right. He's like, the way that Bob like was like backpedaling, doing all these things. I don't know, man. It seemed like Bob was trying to hide something.
Oh,
That's
really?
like, he said that to me, and he's like, I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Ooh, the plot thickens.
But that's what he said to me, and he's like, and I won't say anything. I don't want to talk to anyone about it. He's like, until Bob, were to pass away, because I don't really. And that happened last year. And then I remember the day I learned that he passed. I drove over to Craig's shop and told him, and he's like, oh man, like So nothing really happened with that. But anyway, that's part of the story.
Wow. Well, you may have to be the tiebreaker here then, since you.
Oh, wait a minute.
since-
Hold on. Wait, just real quick, Peter.
Yeah.
Do you believe that Blaze had the inch pincher or not?
Well, no. So here's the thing. I never knew. Obviously, I understood his desire for it to be right. You know what I mean? I do think he brought up some very interesting points that no one else has really ever talked about. Things about the inch pincher. Literally just like in the photographic evidence that no one has ever really pointed out. Like, and I think I brought this up to you. And there's this board. I wish I had a picture of it. Maybe I can give you guys a picture and you can put it up in this podcast. But
for sure.
There was this blackboard, with written all of the similarities between his car and the inch pincher sitting in his shop. And there was like probably 13 or 14 different things that he, had identified as things that were like
Unique.
Unique to the inch pincher that his car also had.
Right.
So he's like, how many coincidences can there be until you just say like that's actually the car? Like that was kind of his mind about the whole thing.
Okay.
Wasn't there ever any cross correlation with VINs or something? I mean, were VINs a thing on this era of Volkswagens? Did they have a VIN plate
they
on
were,
the frame
but
somewhere?
the thing it's ground off on this car.
Oh, okay.
Oh, on the Blaze car?
Yes. Yes, it's ground off.
That's a little suspect. Right there.
Yeah.
Well, and so I'll just say, like, very, very, very simply, the thing hinged on this idea that Dean Lowry built this car. It was really like, it was Darrell Vittone's car, like his daily driver, but it was really like Dean's baby, and he put his heart and soul into this thing and created what it became. And so then there was this moment because Darrell Vittone goes to Vietnam. I believe he gets deployed or something.
He was on. He was gone for 2 weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So he was gone somewhere, and then there was this moment where they basically there's this guy named Heinz Jung who worked for MP, who I believe
He was the art director.
Yeah, the art director. Mm-hmm. And so there was a moment where he basically wants to change the art up, like the livery on the car. And once again, I don't know if Blaze had this right, if this was like the same time, but there's also a moment where they cut a bigger back window into this 56, because an oval window's tiny.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea like, oh, we need to see better when we're bracket racing, so we should cut a bigger back window in. But if you cut the bigger back window in, you have to like redo a bunch of stuff on the car to make it work. And so basically when that happened, because it used to say driver and what did it used to say? It gave Dean Lowry credit like in multiple ways on the car originally.
On the rear quarter panel, it would give him the credit and it would list all the engine parts and then how much horsepower it made.
And also there was times when it would say driver Dean Lowry.
Yeah, there were times when his name would be unique to it, and then there was times when both Darrell's and his name would be on it, and then towards the end it would just be Darrell's name. So that changed.
But that's the situation. So right there, when they finally take his name off, that was Blaze's like, oh, so here is the, like, if you're in a court of law, like, oh, here is the what am I trying to say? Like the reason for the crime or whatever, like the motivation was because like now they're taking his name off, and he was like, he didn't care what ended up happening with it. He just didn't want his car destroyed. That was like what he was saying. So this guy Bob, who Blaze ended up getting the car from, they grew up together with Dean and then his brother Ken Lowry down in wherever,
Santa Ana.
Yeah, Santa Ana area. And so basically the way he told the story was, so instead of getting his car destroyed, he switched the body, gave it to his buddy, and then built a new car and essentially put that body on the new car, and that's the car that had Darrell Vittone's name on it. And he had a bunch of different little things as evidence for that. But one of them is a very fascinating piece that I don't really know an explanation for, but do you know that picture of the inside of the car? It's like looking through the driver's door.
And showing the dash?
Yes.
And the gauge in the dash.
Exactly.
Or the tachometer, whatever it is.
Exactly.
Yes. Right.
But if you look at it, like for instance, like he would show all these different things. Like in part of this display for evidence, he had a 56 rear view mirror, and then he had a 58 rear view mirror, and they're different bolt patterns. Like, they're different the way they're set up. And you look at this picture and it is not a 56 rear view mirror. And so he's like, well, that's clearly not the same car. And then the dash too doesn't, in his mind, once again, I don't know enough about this stuff, but he's like, yeah, this dash doesn't match this car because this is an earlier dash, but this car, because you look at the rearview mirror and these other things, is clearly a later car. And so in his mind, like the car was switched, but since Dean Lowry had built the first car, he built a car that was equally as fast, essentially, and gave it back to them while hiding the real car in Ventura with his friend. And that's kind of how the whole thing went down in his mind. So that's, I don't know if you even heard that whole story, Dean, but that was kind of how he saw it.
A little bit of that.
So anyway, but that was kind of his, basically it came down this whole thing of Dean building this car, Dean Lowry, and him having this love for it and not wanting it to be like chopped up and turned into something else. So anyway, there you go. So that being said, you asked me, do I think his car was the real car? Like I said, I didn't really know, and I didn't have like a stake in this whole thing. When I spoke to Dean Kirsten here, he was explaining to me how the car was chopped up at different times and fiberglass, replaced certain panels and that sort of thing. And yes, the car is totally complete. But it has all these scars that make it, that Blasé always questioned. Like there was a situation, so some of the things, like for instance, the entire car is chrome and CAD plated, like everything on it. Like the sheath, for instance, that the speedometer runs through is CAD plated, or like, every bolt, every nut on the entire thing. And, if you look at pictures, this picture in that famous book, I forget what it is, but maybe Cal Look or something in that book.
Right.
I think it's the Inch Pincher 2, but you look, there's a picture from underneath and the entire car is just like glittering from underneath. It's like unbelievable. Like,
Right.
oh, wow, everything is coated, or chromed. And because basically these cars, they doubled as race cars and show cars essentially to showcase all of MP's stuff. And so he's like, whoa, like this car is all chrome and CAD plated. Like, no way. And when I asked Bob McGinnis, he's like, oh yeah, that's what we all did. He's like, oh yeah, that was like that Dean and Ken were like, oh, you take a car and you instantly take everything apart and you chrome and CAD plate everything. Right. So in his mind, he's like, oh no, that was just what we did. But Blasé, he didn't know that. He's like, oh, there's no way that another car would be like this. So it must be the car, And then there was other things like, he had seen this picture. There's this famous picture of it beating, I think it was a Corvette or something, like, and you see it beating it over the line, and like he had seen that the badge had been taken off the car, and then the chrome that runs up and down the
like a vent.
No, like
like
up
rear...
and down the hood, and it had been removed.
Oh, okay.
And so and his car has it, the car that he had, and so he was like, oh, weird, but it has this undercoating, so he like lifts it up and like scrapes the undercoating away, and then he realizes that it had been basically. What's the term? It had been, he basically could tell that it had been removed and like brazed or whatever, and then had been re-drilled and put back in. He's like, oh wow, my car at one point didn't have this chrome on it. Wow, how fascinating is that? And he starts looking at all these different things that he sees on the Inch Pincher that are like missing from the car, and he realized, oh, they were all missing from my car at one point too, and then they've been put back in. Like somebody was trying to turn a car that was a drag car back into a road car. And so that's kind of what got his wheels spinning, that maybe this was in fact the car. And so he just kind of went down to all these rabbit holes.
So Dean, I see you rolling your eyes there. And
it's a lot to digest.
Yeah, I was about to say.
That's,
well, no.
Yeah.
So, but you don't believe that what Blasé was talking about, that is the car.
No. And probably the biggest reason is the shop that both Dean Lowry and Darrell Vittone worked at was on Indiana Street, and there's a series of workstations outside of the main building along the back. Then there's the spray booth, and then the main building. That's where they worked every day, and until they moved into another location. But during the 60s, they worked right there. The car was there every day, and so the idea that Dean could have taken this home and swapped bodies or something and brought it back and primed it or painted it orange without Darrell knowing it, just to me is a little far-fetched.
Yeah, I mean, it seems crazy for sure.
Because they were all right there. It wasn't like they were in separate
Well, you could confirm this too, but he always talked about this idea, because I know like they used to dip cars in acid, like back in the day, to lighten them and to remove paint and that sort of thing. And so he's like, oh yeah, he was Dean, he was the head of whatever. Like he could just tell someone, they're like, oh, go dip this car, and that was like in his mind that was possible, that could have happened. And I mean, and once again, a non-car guy like talking about car things. So
you've been hanging out with Dan?
Yeah. Yeah. But like it's my understanding that a lot of those cars, a lot of famous race cars, it's not really one car. Like they had 5 bodies for them, and they're often switching them. And I'm not talking about the Inch Pincher specifically, but there was that's like a normal thing for a lot of those old cars. Like you could never really say this was the car, because it was actually 5 different cars, and they, for different reasons, they'd swap them out. And so in Blasé's mind, like that could have been possible in this situation. And once again, Blasé didn't know any of this really to be true. It was just his own,
But Blasé is explaining this to you while he still has this car.
Yes. Well, and the car's in Santa Barbara right now.
So, okay, so there is a car that exists that he claims as the Inch Pincher.
Yes.
Could it possibly be where maybe Kirsten sees the car and says,
Well,
these
you've
things
seen the
don't
car,
line up.
right?
Yeah, I've seen the car a couple of times.
Yeah.
I saw it back in 2005 the first time, and I looked at it for 20 minutes or so, and I kept questioning him. This was 2005, so at that time, the Chalet brothers, who worked at MP and Dino Dinosaurs, are alive.
Yes.
Dean Lowry has passed away. Darrell Vittone's alive. Jim Bentley is gone, and there's enough guys that worked on that car every day, including Ken Lowry. Call him. Call Darrell up. I got it.
Right.
Here's my phone. Call him up, and he will tell you exactly what happened.
Right.
And I could never get a good answer. I said, these guys are, some of them, obviously, Joe Vittone has passed away by then. He said, just ask these guys, and he wouldn't do it. He just kind of blew that off.
Right. No, for sure.
Do you think that was maybe a little bit of sense of not wanting to know the truth?
Well, I think that's probably part of it.
For
sure. Yeah. Well, and also he, he burned bridges with almost every single person that he ended up being in contact with. So he butted heads with every single person, and he was just he was the sort of person that if he felt like you had any sort of disrespect towards him, he immediately his bristles went up, and so I think that. He's obviously telling this story that a lot of people disagree with. So he just he butted heads with everybody. And so I think that, and just kind of the way he was, I think that he didn't really trust anyone else anyway. And so that was he didn't really even care what anyone said.
So I'd like to talk about the end of 1966 I think that was the big change for this car.
Totally.
So going into the 1967 racing season, NHRA re-indexed the class and changed the weight rules, and they were able to lighten the car drastically. And so obviously they're going to take advantage of it. So that's the point when this car was pretty much all steel till they really started making radical changes. So if this would have happened, if Dean had a problem with it, it would have been at the end.
Earlier.
It would have been at the end of the 66 season. However, the idea of cutting the back window out and putting a bigger back window was Dean's idea. Because if he's in the right lane and he gets the head start, he can't see the car out of the left lane because the window's so small. And he thought, well, if we only had a big window, then I could see better. So that was Dean's idea. That wasn't Darrell's idea. That was Dean's idea.
Oh yeah, Blaze always said it was Joe's idea, but that's good to hear that it was Dean.
No, it was strictly, Dean's the driver.
Right, yeah.
It didn't matter. Darrell didn't mind it. He didn't have a problem with it. But Dean, that was one of his ideas. And with unlimited resources at Econo Motors and at MP, they'd do, like you said, they would do anything. So during that time, they replaced the doors. We replaced the doors, the fenders, the deck lid, the hood. They cut the back window. And like you mentioned earlier, to remove the oval window and replace it, you have to cut the vents too. You have to go all the way.
Louvers, right?
The louvers, right?
Yes.
You have to cut all. You can't just do the window. You have to do that whole back. So they're cutting the whole back of the roof off. So they did that. And then they also took the floor pans. They cut the floor pans, put aluminum inserts in the floor pans. It probably already had fiberglass seats by then. And so they really lightened the heck out of it. And they probably cut the firewall and the bulkhead out of it too, because they really probably took 400 or 500 pounds out of the car. And so coming into February or late January of 67, the car is completely different. It's got all these fiberglass parts. The paint job is radical. It's got flames and pinstriping and metal flake. And so that was really the big change. And to me, I think Dean was on board on all those changes. I don't see him saying, oh, it's, we can't cut this car up. It's my baby. He wanted to go fast, and he
wanted to win. Yeah.
He wanted to win.
Yeah, for
exactly.
sure.
So I just don't buy into that.
Yeah.
And being able to, somehow, I'm sure he could take the car home, say, hey, I'm going to the races in the morning. I'll take it home on a trailer, and then we're going to go to the races, first thing in the morning. That I can see. But somehow swapping bodies and bringing back another body and pushing it into the spray booth and say, okay, guys, go for it.
No, I mean, it certainly feels far-fetched.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so then let's get into, I think we should get into the idea of, that Blaze said that it disappeared. And so I think we should explore that. And so when to say, okay, now we're talking the end of 69.
Right.
And this is the point where Dean Lowry is now left, and he is now working at Dino Dinosaurs with his brother Ken. So it's Darrell Vittone's show, 100%. He's the head of MP&R&D. And so at the end of '69, he decides that next year we're making a complete change. So he had the body shop at Economotors take a '59 big window body sunroof and chop it, because people were thinking that by chopping the top, they would be more aerodynamic and pick up a couple miles per hour. So he had the body shop chop a new body. So in December of '69, there's pictures of it where they're taking the Inch Pincher 1 body off over there on University Street and putting it in a shed next door. And that's where it was for probably a year. Then they put the new body on and finished it. So when it went to the Winter Nationals in 1970, it was the original floor pan, original same motor, same front end and all that, BRM wheels with the new body on it. So it was a combination of the two.
And this is now what was known as the Inch Pincher 2.
That is correct.
Yes.
So it's a 2, T-O-O. That's his second car. So this is more Darrell's car now. It's not Dean's old car, if you will. It's Darrell's car.
It was the same chassis, different body.
That's right.
Okay.
So now we have the Inch Pincher body, the first car, the orange car. The '56 body is sitting in a shed.
One.
And the story goes about 6 months after it had been sitting there a while, Darrell doesn't want it anymore. Pancho Mendoza, he's a drag racer from Mexico City, came up to see the Vittones, sees that body and says, "What are you going to do with that?" And Darrell says, "Nothing. I'm done with it. I have a new chop top, Molly paint job, gorgeous car. I don't need that anymore." He said, "Would you sell it?" He said, "Sure." So maybe $2,000, it got sold. So Pancho Mendoza gets a Penske or a Hertz rental truck, comes up and just buys the body, because he says it's easier to take the body across the border than a whole car with a floor pan. It's just a part now. So he loads that body up, and he ended up buying another body from Dave Andrews, who was Darrell's partner, another oval body. And so he had two bodies, went to Mexico City. So the Inch Pincher 1 body is now in Mexico City, and they put it on another floor pan.
We're talking like early 70s right now.
Early 70s.
Yes.
That's correct. And now Pancho Mendoza decides, well, if Darrell's chopping the top, we need to chop the top, because that's what the Americans are doing. So they chopped this car, and you think about it, so it's a '56 body with this big back window in it. So it's really a hamburger of body styles. And they chop it, and they put a visor on it for some reason. And they don't quite finish it, but they make some runs on it. And so then he ends up, Pancho sells it to a guy named Jorge Fernandez. And Jorge Fernandez says he's going to finish the car. We're going to paint it. We're going to do it. And he does nothing. He doesn't do anything. So about a year later, a guy named Rodolfo Valencia says he's got a shop in Mexico City. He says, "I want that car." He buys it, and he finishes it. So now the car is painted purple, and it says Inch Pincher on it again. It's got gold wheels, and he puts his motor in his trans, and it starts running in Mexico. So that is the original body, now all morphed out and changed, but that's the original Inch Pincher body, and that survives till about '79 when it's in a towing accident where it comes off the trailer, an open trailer, and it's destroyed. Oh. And Rodolfo says that it was, what did he say? It was bent. And I think that kind of says it. So they cut it up in pieces, and he keeps the motor and trans, puts it in the dragster, and so the Inch Pincher 1 body is gone by 1979. So that's the end of that part of it. So now we have
the chassis,
and
the motor and whatnot.
So now the chassis is alive and well on the Inch Pincher 2. Well, something happens at EMPI that really changes things is Joe Vittone sells EMPI to Filter Dynamics. And they're the Lee Eliminators, and they have a number of companies in drag racing, and they want that car. That car is an icon. They want that car to continue being raced. So Joe cuts the deal, says, okay, the car's included. So then he tells Darrell, oh, by the way, the car belongs to Filter Dynamics now. And needless to say, Darrell was pissed beyond belief. But Joe had, he had the power to do that. He says, oh, but the good thing is they want to pay you to race it. So for another year, a little over a year, they pay Darrell Vittone and Jim Bentley to take it on tour and to race it for the Lee Eliminators. And if you look at the door, then it says Lee Eliminators along the bottom. Well, Darrell loved racing, but he hated all the PR visits and going to these open houses for Zodi's and all the fast food places. And he said, I hated it. So after about a year and a half, he says, I'm done with this. I can't stand it. I want to build another car. So he returns the car to Filter Dynamics and says, I'm out of here. So then they bring in the Carlson brothers, Jim and Rick Carlson, young guys. He said, okay, you guys are going to take this all over the country, race it, do the PR deal, and they're happy as clams. And they race it. And then the next year, which is 73, Rick Johnson comes in. He's a funny car driver. He gets a job. And so the two of them take it all over the country. And so at the end of the 73 season, Filter Dynamics announces, we're done. We're not doing racing anymore. And they ended up going out of business the following year. So the car, the trailer, the spare motors, all that stuff gets returned to Filter Dynamics in Cleveland, Ohio, and said, this is it. So there's an ad that appears in National Dragster a few months later for sale for like $5,000 for everything, the car, the trailer, everything. And it takes a while before it gets sold, but it ends up being sold probably 6, 8, 9 months later to Dennis Dougherty of Mother's Performance in New Jersey. He buys the car. And he races it for about a year or so, doesn't have much luck with it. And this is where the story kind of becomes rumor. He sells it to a racer in Minnesota, and what he does with it, we're not sure. The story that I got from another racer, Bill Mitchell, who raced VWs in the time, that he drastically changed it, possibly took the Volkswagen motor out of it and put a V8 in it, but used the body. Who knows? And they crashed it, and that was the end of it. So that is the demise of the two cars, or the two halves.
Two parts, yes.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Man.
So both the chassis and the body are kaput.
Kaput. Yeah.
And that door is from the original car before they went to the...
Yeah, so this door right here represents the first fiberglass door that was on the inch pincher. This goes probably back to 65. And this was hand laid, I guess the word would be, by Don Roundtree. And Don Roundtree had a shop at the Flaybob Airport in Riverside. And so this was the first pair of fiberglass doors that went on the inch pincher. And this was before EMPI offered their own fiberglass production doors. So this is a rib door. So this was splashed off a 55, an earlier oval. And it's got the Richard McPeak lettering and stuff. And then the paint, the Metal Flake paint, was done at Economotors. So this door would be the second door that was on the inch pincher one. So the original steel door would be the first one. This is the second one. And you can see that they had to remove the hinges off the steel door, reuse them on this. And then in 66 or going in 67, when they did the drastic redo, EMPI then had their own production doors, I believe were made by Kellison. And they ripped the hinges off of this, reused them again, and then this went in the dumpster.
I was about to say, this hasn't, just the life of this door alone. You were telling us before the show how interesting it is, how the door ended up where it is today.
Yeah. So this door, from what Darrell thinks, is we just threw them in the dumpster. Somebody fished them out of the dumpster, and it ended up in Minnesota. So the story goes, a guy named Lauren Richards had a machine shop, and a guy comes in and needs a part for his drill press. He needs a chuck. And so he goes, yeah, I got that, and it's $25. He goes, well, I don't have any money. He said, but I do have something I could trade. So he brings in this door, and Lauren's more of a Porsche guy. And he looks at the door. He goes, that's actually kind of cool. And so they make a trade. So that's how the door gets to Lauren in his shop in Minnesota. And it was, like I said earlier, he didn't have a place on the wall, so he drilled it and mounted it on the ceiling of his office. It was there for years. And then he moved to Camp Verde, Arizona, took it with him, and then that's where we found it.
And you saw it there.
So I had heard a friend of mine who was a big collector knew about it, and he would only tell me about half the story. He goes, "Well, I know where the door for the inch pincher is." I said, "Oh, really?" He says, "Yeah." And so I grind on him. And he says, "It's in Arizona. It's in this guy's shop in Arizona." I said, "Why don't you buy it?" "Well, I will. Yeah, I'll get around to it." And I'm like, "You're crazy if you don't jump on this." And so it was there for, I don't know, 10 years or so. And one thing led to another is that we got a story. Lauren saw the lightning bug, which was also sponsored by Ampy, and told Paul Chalet at the Grand National Roadster Show that I have a door that has Ampy on it. And of course, Paul Chalet went, "Really? How big? How big?" He says, "Oh, it's full size." And he said, "What color is it?" He goes, "Orange." Well, immediately Paul said, "What did you know about this?" He says, "Well," he told him this story. And so one thing led to another is we made a deal to put it in the Chalet Museum. So I drove at warp speed to Camp Verde to get this door and got there, and I couldn't believe it. I just could not believe that this thing actually existed.
Wow.
And so when
Somebody
Darrell
saved it.
Yeah, and so when Darrell saw it, he goes and he signed it. He says, "Absolutely, that's the first fiberglass doors we had on that car."
Wow.
It's one of the few. There's only one other piece from the original car, and that's the deck lid that's still owned.
And this is in the museum. You took it out for a day,
Yes,
right? Just
yeah.
for the show.
That's it, just for
Wow.
you guys to show that this is the inch pincher did exist, and this is the only part that's basically known to exist.
Wow.
We appreciate that very much because this is a nice touch
Yeah.
to
So
see the
cool.
door. Yeah.
That is a really cool thing to do.
History right
yeah,
there.
Yeah. Well, that's why it deserves its own chair here in the
yeah.
studio. 'Cause,
yeah.
a stupid question. I'm going to pretend I'm Dan and non-car guy.
Oh, thanks.
No, because you might have said it. I wasn't paying attention, but what's the deal with the name?
Dean Lowry came up with that name, and I'm not quite sure his thinking behind it, but I always heard it was Dean's. That was Dean's phrase for it, and it wasn't adapted to the car till 1965, and it just kept everybody. It just worked.
Well, I think it was this whole idea that it has like very small cubic inches and it's beating all these V8s. And so that was the idea. It was like pinching out all the power you could out of the small, I think that's how I was
I would have to agree to that.
Yeah.
Sure.
I could see
knows?
that. Yeah.
All right, so not a sexual thing.
But
so,
we
yeah.
will say, no. But I will say, and it's fascinating. And I guess if we could put into this podcast, like the amount of images out there of the inch pincher beating cars that were, it should have lost to in most people's minds. Like it just destroyed. I mean,
Well, that was one of the things that people were talking about on social media. They're like,
Absolutely.
"There's no way it beat
Yeah.
a Cobra.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
no
No, it
way
did.
it beat."
Yeah.
it beat everything.
And
I mean,
me being an import guy, I'm like all about beating big V8 heavy cars or
Right,
whatever.
right.
So I was like, oh, I could totally believe that because they, you
can
can
get
do
behind
it.
it, yeah.
So, but they were just doing it before everybody else was doing it, right?
And two, we're talking about handicap racing here. So with the indexes and the pounds per cubic inch, the Volkswagen always got the head start. And so, yeah, they're not heads up with a Cobra, but they're getting a couple of trees on or a tree, and they're getting way out there. And so the crowd loved it because here they have these Hemi cars and Cobras and Mustangs chasing this Mustang down, and they're passing them in the lights at 130 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's the people that don't understand bracket racing. Bracket racing is not always heads up. You have someone's ahead of you or whatever, but it's still timed. You still have to you can't be too fast and you can't
That's
be
right.
too slow. So bracket racing is very, very difficult.
What,
the way,
what do
do-
we think that car was making in its heyday as far as
I was going
horsepower?
to ask that question.
Without the conversion factor, probably maybe 180.
Oh, that's pretty
brake
good.
without
That's
a
great.
at the flywheel. Now, they would always add 10% or so because Volkswagen added that to their SAE rating. So there would say 200, 220, 230, but in reality, maybe 180 on this car.
And how much-
But was that via NA or was the car turbocharged
It
or
was
supercharged
normally
or anything
aspirated.
like that? NA.
So it would be a 2,000 cc in 69. It would have been a 2,000 cc motor, dual 48 IDA Webers.
Wow.
12 and a half, 13 to 1 compression. It ran a Porsche gearbox, a 350 Porsche gearbox, because you could get different gear ratios. But the car weighed.
I was going to say, obviously, power to weight ratio
Yeah,
was
it's
what was
1,200
making it
pounds
so
or
fast.
Yeah, they were,
The thing was styrofoam. It was like
But
a balsa wood
but
car.
even then, a 2 liter putting out even 180, conservatively.
In that day, that's
in that
crazy.
day, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's pretty freaking good.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Well, and you're talking before, like, machining the ways we have it too. So like a lot of this stuff is hand done. Like the
yeah,
heads
yeah.
all hand done. Well, and like they talk about like Dean, like in that I think Blaze, he had just this great respect. He's like, you look at these heads that that Dean would work on, and they're just works of art. Like they're unbelievable. Way before CNCs, way before anything like that.
Well, I mean, this is another controversial topic about, because I know plenty engine builders who do use CNC and plenty that don't. Still don't, like the old timers, and they prefer it that way. For whatever reason, they get nuances that the machine can't get, like an art form, basically.
Totally, yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to make that comparison because it's still alive today.
Yes.
So
Is that like a Steve Feist thing? Is Steve that way or no?
I think he can go both ways on that.
Oh, okay.
Because he has got machines. Joey Gross, who builds his race engines. I'm sure he uses CNC, but they built it all by hand too. So. It's hard to say. I think it depends on the application too. What you're going for. I know plenty of guys, especially rotary guys. There's guys that do all the cool billet, and just CNC'd everything, and guys who are literally building in their shed with, a grinder, and making crazy power too, reliable power. So you can go both ways on that. I think.
And so you say you 2-liter, but was it a 2180 essentially? Is that what it was?
No, that's where Dean Lowry's came into play when they started Dino Dinosaur, because that was a big rift between Dean Lowry and Joe Vittone. MP sold 88 millimeter pistons, and that was their size that they were made in Japan, and they had really good luck with them. Well, Dean felt that we could put a 92 in this motor.
Yeah.
And he says, I can do this. This is a Dodge piston. We can get some cylinders made, and we can make more power. We can make an 1835 out of a 69 millimeter stroke. And Joe said, nope, we're not doing there. 88's the safe way. You don't mill as much on the heads and the case. And that was one of the many reasons why Dean left, because he felt that those 92 barrels were such a good idea, and they could sell so well that when he left in 68 and started Dino Dinosaur, that was his prize. He said, we're going to do these 92 millimeter pistons and cylinders. And that became the 2180. So up to then, 2000 cc's was pretty much the common size for the inch pincher motor, or 82 by 88 motor, maybe 89s later on. So the 2180 was really Dean's deal.
Did they keep the stock stroke? And they just go with
no. To do that, you would have to put an 80. You go from a 69 millimeter stroke to an 82.
Oh, okay.
So there was roller cranks. SPG and MP had roller cranks made in Europe, and they would weld up stock cranks. And Acrossa started making cranks too. So you're definitely going to have to stroke it to get that kind of size.
So an aside here. So the car that, got me started on this whole thing that was, claimed to be the inch pincher. So that car, it's really fascinating because that car has a 2180 in it, which once again would explain that it's not actually the original inch pincher. It would have been something maybe later.
So the story that I've gotten, actually, I think you helped me on this one, is that when Dino Dinosaurs, one of the cars that they campaigned was the Pterosaur.
Now, is it who made it? It's not a Kellison. What is it? The fiberglass company that made it?
Amanda, I think. I can't remember.
I meant to look it up before the show.
I'm not
but is this fiberglass kind of looking? I would say it has like a European kind of flair, like maybe kind of like a Dino or something like that. But it's a full fiberglass car, and I think they made a couple hundred of them or whatever.
Right.
This is like a kit car.
So that was the Pterosaur, and that was a Bonneville car. It ran at Bonneville Salt Flats, and so it was on a VW floor pan, and Ken drove it at Bonneville, and they ran it.
Dean Lowry's brother, Ken Lowry.
Yeah, Dean's out of the picture by now. He's kind of off on his own now. And that was Ken's baby. And so they ran two different size engine. They ran 159, maybe 160 at Bonneville with the Pterosaur. The story goes is the long block from the Pterosaur is in Blaze's car.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And that's the story. And I find that fascinating because if you were to take that engine apart and look at the parts.
Well, so it has a Acrossa crank in it, which is really fascinating.
Now, you know that for a fact?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he had it pulled apart at one point.
Really?
Yeah, and then I remember he showed me an old, I think it was maybe a Hot VWs, and there's like ads for these Ocrasa parts.
Right.
He had these parts, they're like pinned on his wall.
Right.
And so he always would talk about how this motor had Ocrasa, and it had all these, the motor too. Like we should get the car. You should get you to look at the car again, because it's still sitting there in Santa Barbara at his brother's house. But it has all these like pre-production DDS stuff on it. So like it's like before it was actually like stamped, and so it's just fascinating. It's full of all these really fascinating parts, and I will say, Dean. Well, no, it'd be Ken Lowry's son. I had him. Don. Yeah. I got in touch with him. In trying to tell this whole story, and he came out and checked out the car because he had raced himself, and he had built 2180s and all these sorts of things.
Sure.
So he looked at it. He's like, "Oh, this can't be the motor that was in the inch pincher." That was what he said. But he's like, "Oh, this could have been a motor that my dad, and that's what Bob McGinnis, I think, kind of was kind of like an uncle to him growing up, because they were really close. Bob McGinnis and his dad Ken were really, when I think they both ended up working at Magnuson.
I think so.
So anyway, to him, it was like a really cool moment to come see this car, because he hadn't seen it since he was a kid. He said he remembered seeing it when he was really young, and they used to drag race it and that sort of thing. And so when this guy Bob just reaches out to me out of the blue, he's like, "Hey, I was the one that sold that car in 1990 to your friend Blaze or whatever." And then it was very fascinating, because he I think he was well in mid 80s or something like that, and just the specific things he remembered about that car. I mean, he'd tell me to like the 100th of a second, like what he was running on the quarter mile, and he would all these different really fascinating things. But to me, trying to tell this story, he was totally silent on certain things that I would have really helped basically push forward the story. Like, for instance, I said, "Well, where did you get the car from?" And he couldn't tell me. He couldn't remember. He's like, "Oh, I think I got it from a farmer in the San Fernando Valley," is what he told me. I was like, "Oh, what?" And I was like, "Oh, what color?" He says, "It's a blue color. It's a Chevy blue." He told me the exact like paint code for it too. He's like, "Oh, it's like this blue. It's a Chevy truck color." And I was like, "Oh, what color was it before?" And once again, he couldn't tell me. But it's fascinating, that car, because it's been sitting out in the sun a bunch since he passed. There's all this orange coming through the blue. It's wild. Which once again, I'm not here to say that it's the car, but it's just all these crazy. To his point, like, there's so many coincidences about this car, and the fact that he buys it from a childhood friend of the guy who famously built the car. It doesn't. It's not that crazy of a stretch of imagination to start imagining things about the car and its history.
Well, and I think the confusion kind of opens up the door to
speculation.
Speculation. Yes. But it almost sounds like when you start to put all these pieces together, there's a little bit of truth here, there's a little bit of truth here. This has been fudged, that's been fudged, this could be this. That. I mean, it just, there's really no straight answer.
There's two things about that Blaze's story that I find kind of fascinating. One, the orange paint.
Yes.
Yeah, I always told, "Well, Blaze, remove the blue paint. We'll know in an hour." "No, I can't do that. Can't do that." The other thing is the fact that body and the pan are a mismatch.
Right.
So if he were to pull out the inch pincher body, if we follow along that road, and he pulled the body off because the pan stayed there, and he swapped bodies, he would only have the body. And the fact it's a 56, he only had the body, and it's orange underneath. Those three things, I have to admit.
Well, and then another thing I said to you.
Story's getting interesting.
Well, another thing I said to you, which he always used to, be one of the, the feathers in his hat to be like, "I have the inch pincher," was, I don't know if you did the interview, but Darrell Vittone's last interview with Hot VW.
Yes.
So in his last interview, there's this moment. Did you write that article?
Yes.
Yeah, which is crazy. No, because I have the magazine at my house. I should have brought it. But what?
Two parts.
2005, 6,
Something like that. I don't remember.
And it basically says there's this moment, and you wrote it, which is so funny. But it's like there's this right behind the firewall. There is a weld all the way across the tunnel, like from the driver's side to the passenger side of the tunnel, and the reason for that is because they used to run a basically auxiliary brake pedal that they put on the other side. It would have been like a moon or who would have made it was it a moon? Would that make?
Actually, it was a hydraulic.
Right, a hydraulic. But I'm trying to remember the company that made it.
It was a hydraulic throttle.
Yes. Hydraulic throttle. Yes,
Yeah.
and you had to run all that stuff through the tunnel.
Yes.
And so in this article, it says, like, hint, hint. I think it's exactly what it says. It says, hint, hint. If you ever find the original pan, it's going to have this weld. And so in Blaze, and he'd already thought it was the car before he ever read that article. And then he sees it and he's like, look, my car has this weld. Like, why is there a weld here? It doesn't make any sense. And so that was another piece of it. And another thing I'll say about the car that is really fascinating that we talked about is the back windows of the car are etched glass, and they have the Dino dinosaur, which is, well, Dino, right? The dinosaur from what?
Hanna-Barbera.
Yeah.
The cartoon.
Yeah.
And then it's like driving a car. That's like the logo of DDS, and that's etched into the back windows, which, as far as I know, there's no other car in the world that has that. And he always said, and once again, you probably could ascertain if this was true or not, but he said there was only 2 pairs of windows ever made, and the other one was in, what's his name? Like the most famous VW racer of the 70s. And he was at DDS in the very beginning. What's his name? Not Clyde. Berg. Berg.
Gene Berg?
He said it was in his shop. Gene Berg had the other set of windows, is what he always swore was true. So there's 2 sets of windows. Gene Berg has them on the wall in his shop, and the other ones are on my car.
That could be possible.
Wait a minute. Did Blaze know about the whole Mexico story about the body?
Oh,
going
no,
there?
he was aware that was like a theory.
And he didn't believe that.
No, because he would die on the fact that he had it. So
Interesting.
no, but like I said, you start searching on the internet, you're gonna find a lot of different theories about what happened.
Oh no,
I've
seen that. But does Blaze believe he has the chassis or the body?
No, just the body.
Just the body.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and then he, I think he also kind of believed that the motor. I think in his mind he understood that DDS is after MP and the motor's full of DDS stuff. So I don't think he. Well, and he'd actually he didn't buy the motor with the car. I don't know if I told you this.
No.
So he didn't have enough money. I think he bought the car for $3,000 or something. He bought the car and it had a blown motor. And the only reason he saw it is because the guy Bob was a cabinet builder, or he did something with wood. He was like a woodworker, and so it was kept in his shop. And so he would say like every 6 months he'd push it out and like wash all the sawdust off of it. And so I actually have this really cool moment where he tells the story where he's riding his bike and he's Blaze is a very dynamic kind of storyteller, and that's why I really connected with him, because he could just tell stories in this really fascinating way. And he's like, I'm riding by and I look over in this parking lot and I see this oval window. He's like, whoa, look at that oval window. Like, he's like, everyone wanted an oval window, even then and now, and he's like, and so he goes and he chases the guy for a long time and finally meets him, and he's like, I want to buy that car. And he's like, no, you can't have it, and all these sorts of things. And in the end, he like finally goes to the guy's shop and he's got cash. He's like, I want to buy the car. He's like, I got $3,000 right now. And the guy's like, oh, sorry, I already sold it. He's like, what? You sold the car? He's like, I've told you so many times I want it. He's like, oh yeah, I sold it to the kid who works here, and he's going to like work it off. He's going to like, he's like, what? He's like, you were supposed to sell me that car. And so he's like, oh, so I stuck $3,000 in his face. I was like, how about you take $3,000 and I take it right now? And he's like, sure. And he like grabbed the money and then he took it. That's his story. And then there's a picture of him shaking hands with this guy, Bob. And I have this picture.
Interesting.
Okay. Him shaking hands with Bob against in front of his shop. The car is covered in dust. And then I have pictures after that where he takes over his shop, which is like, he was on, well, whatever. It's like 4 blocks from here. I think whatever. He's like off a transport, like over here. And then he washes it off for the first time. There's pictures of this car, and the paint is actually still really good at this point, and it's just sitting in the sun, freshly washed, and that's when he first gets the car. But the motor, the guy's like, oh, you have to spend more money for the motor. And so like a few months later, he goes back to try to buy this race motor or whatever from the guy because it's sitting up on the shelf, and he goes and the motor's gone. And he's like, where'd the motor go? He's like, oh, I traded it. And this guy I brought up earlier, the upholsterer guy, his name is Craig. He did a trade and took that motor from the guy Bob and was sitting in his shop, which is another neighbor. And I've become really good friends with Craig. And so Craig will tell the story. He's like, oh yeah, and Blaze really wanted this motor. And so once again, they traded somehow, and then Blaze ended up with that motor, and that's and then he put it in the car, and that's how the whole thing kind of ended up to be where it is. So anyway.
Man. I feel like this is going to turn into like this 12-part saga.
Well, I told you
we're going to have to bring in a few more guests that can cooperate with.
But please, okay. So as the experts of the automotive podcast that's telling all these cool stories, you guys recognize that like it was the right thing to do. Like I was going to jump into this story. Like I said, I literally did this Google search. It was like at 11 o'clock at night, and I was like, "What? This is a crazy story." Like, and once again, whatever the truth is, that's like kind of beside the point. It's just a fascinating tale that like has a lot of like weight to it and a lot of like emotional kind of like controversy.
Yeah.
So anyway,
like Dean was saying, there's interesting points that you bring up that are factual points that help Blaze's side of the story, not the whole story.
No,
right?
Sure, yes.
But that's at the same time, what Dean's saying, like the whole thing with Mexico, there are other people involved that can confirm the story if they're still alive or whatever. But it still could be, maybe, because no one actually physically saw the body in Mexico that's still alive, at least, right?
No, it's destroyed.
Yeah.
It was in the towing accident, but no photos were taken after the accident.
Yeah.
That's true.
And another interesting thing that I probably didn't talk to you about, but so when Dean passes away, what year would this have been?
99.
So, by the way, in 98, Dean had invited Blaze to his shop in Arizona. Do you know about this?
No.
So he had a handwritten letter from him inviting him to his shop in Arizona, and he knew because there was this guy at the Pomona swap meet that was like neighbors with Dean. The reason he met him because he was at Pomona all the time. Everybody at Pomona back in like the 90s, 80s, and 90s like knew him, and he was always buying these rare DDS parts and all these sorts of things. And he said he came across this guy. I'm not going to say the name because I'm forgetting right now. I'd have to look. I have like many hours of footage of him talking about this story. But he shows up at this booth and he sees valve covers with Dean Lowry's signature on them. And he's like, "Where did you get these? Like, how did you get these things?" He's like, "Oh, he's my neighbor in Arizona." And he knew I was coming out to the Pomona swap meet, so he signed these things for me, and I'm selling them. And he's like, "You know Dean Lowry?" And he's like, "I have this car, and that I think, maybe he was involved in." And there's like this whole thing. And then so he gives the guy a picture of his car, which he apparently went back and showed to Dean Lowry. And shortly thereafter, he gets a letter from Dean Lowry inviting him out to meet him. And he's like, "Hey, bring all your DDS parts. I'll sign them all for you."
Wow.
And he had, tons of rare parts. Yeah. And, unfortunately, Blaze had a younger brother who died tragically right then at this moment, which kind of altered his life. But so he basically for a year, he just kind of like was kind of dead to the world after his brother died. And then that was the year that Dean passed. So he always talked about how his moment of like being able to vindicate or like figure out the true story passed when Dean died. Yeah. So I think that there's like a really fascinating thing, but in the Dean Lowry memorial, there's this like pamphlet that was printed up for when Dean Lowry actually died. And in the memorial, it says a Dean Lowry built street strip car resides in Ventura, California. And that was his car. And it was actually listed. He has a copy of it in his office. A copy of the actual memorial of Dean Lowry.
I went to Dean's memorial. I probably have that somewhere, but I just went.
Yeah. Well, and then his mind, like I said, to the public, he would never question his own story. It was always like, I'm going to go out there like a bull in a china shop and be like, this is the story. I'm just like, make it true. But in private, he was like, he would question his own story. And he's like, man, would I rather have the inch pincher or would I rather have a Dean Lowry built street strip car? He's like, I'd take that any day of the week is what he would say. So he's like, I don't even care if it's inch pincher. He's like, I still got the Dean Lowry built car. That was what he kind of would say.
When you said it was a special, regardless, it was a special car.
Now, which car are we talking about?
The one that he had.
The one that he had,
because Ken admitted that they had built a couple of street cars for customers, and the fact that Bob worked for Jerry, and they were good friends with the Lowry, so there's a good, solid connection there. So it has some good history to it, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna have to make a field trip, like to go see this car, like opening up Al Capone's vault.
Well, I have pictures of it I can share with you guys that you can put on the show. I took a bunch of because we were gonna list it actually. We were gonna try to sell it at auction.
Well, getting like Dean to come take a look and not just look but verify, like what you're saying. I was like, oh, that's the thing or that's the deal, and that's these are all make sense. Not to say that you're a liar, but
one of the things that Blaze would talk about is the windshield height.
Right.
So a 56 body, the windows are smaller, and as the
all the way around
evolved, the windows got bigger. And some of the front shots of the car at the drag strip, he would say that's not a 56 windshield. That is a later windshield. It's too big. It's too tall. And so that goes to his side of the story that the body was switched to a later one with a big back window in it. And I've since taken some of those pictures in Photoshop and scaled those pictures. and looked at the window openings for the fiberglass doors because it changed. And I couldn't, it to me, it always was 56. I couldn't see where the height of the windshield changed. And the mirror thing, I never really paid that much attention to.
You should look at the picture.
Rear view mirror difference. I'm not a 56
When
guy.
in my possession, I have the two rear view mirrors. I have the 58 and the 56 that were hanging on his wall. I have them at my house because I just thought it was a cool thing to keep. Right. So he always told this story, and I don't know how he heard this story. It was maybe some sort of hearsay, but he said he met this guy who apparently after a race, Darrell wins the race, and he walks out on the strip and talks to him. And he's like, "Hey, is this the car that Dean Lowry cut the back window into?" And the guy and Darrell's like, "Yeah, this is the car." And he's like, "Oh, what a nice guy. He cut in all the windows for you." That's like what the quote was. So basically what he's saying there is all the windows are bigger, so no, this has to be a different car. That's like basically what he's inferring in that. And then Blaze, the way that Blaze would tell a story is there's a moment when the car has the top replaced, what they call it the Landau top, which is this flower power thing. Right. And if you look at those pictures, in his mind, he had all these pictures pasted on his wall next to each other. He's like, "Look, this is a bigger windshield." He's like, "Now the next time you see the car, it has a Landau top and a smaller 56 windshield put back in it, and they put this top on to hide the welds." No. That's what he said though. Jesus. But that's the thing. But there you go, man.
So the story on the top was that it had so much Bondo in it, is that they were towing, through Texas or Oklahoma, and it was, sub-zero or 20s or something, and they pulled into a gas station and it blistered.
Oh, yeah.
All the Bondo and the roof blistered. And so they're going, they didn't want it because it was metal flaked and flamed and striped. And so they had this company that did these tops for the Manx buggies, and he says, "No, just put a Landau top on it." So they came up with that material and put it on. So it was to cover up some horrendous bodywork.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah.
What's the more believable story, Bigfoot or inch pincher? I don't know.
Man. I don't know.
I was so naive walking in here thinking, we're going to have the answer. We're going to get the answer.
The saga continues.
I've even got a better one. So I ran across this guy in Florida covering an event years ago, and he came up to me and he knew me, and he was friends with Joe Vittone. Joe Vittone retired in Ocala, Florida, and so that's where he lived for most of his life towards the end. And this guy was friends with him, and he said, "Can I can't tell you because we were at an event and I didn't have a lot of time." He says, "Give me your address. I'm going to send you a letter. I want to tell you a story, but we don't have time to do it." Fine. So I get this letter, and he goes on to tell the story that there was actually 2 inch pincher ones, identical. One was publicly seen, the other one was hidden. One was 300 or 400 pounds lighter and a bigger engine than the other one. And this guy's story was that at Pomona, you would qualify in one day, and then obviously living in Riverside, you would take the car home and then you'd bring it back the next day for eliminations. So his story was that they would qualify one car. It would be all legal. NHRA would put their approval on it, and then they'd swap cars, and the day of eliminations, they'd bring out the second car, and it would be obviously
Fresh
quicker
car.
and faster.
Wow.
And I'm like, "Oh, you got to be kidding me." And so
That's a good story.
I sent this letter to Darrell, and Darrell was hysterical. He goes, "We didn't have barely enough money for one car, let alone 2 cars, And then he went on to say that the engines they put tie wraps and seals and things on them to prevent anything like that you couldn't swap a motor. He said, everything. NHRA knew every trick in the book.
That is interesting.
That's urban legend.
Story
Definitely urban legend.
Throws right in there too.
Okay, inch pincher or JFK's?
Yeah.
Say which story can you get to the bottom?
It's funny. I thought about that during one section of something. And man, was there one shooter or
Paul was the walrus.
Yeah.
It
Paul
was the
dead.
second gunman on the grassy knoll.
Oh my gosh!
Turns out Joe Vittone was actually a CIA asset. Yeah, exactly.
So yet another one. So Joe Vittone had a love-hate relationship with Volkswagen. He was one of the largest. He had one of the largest dealerships in the country. like you said, they had to deal with him because he was selling the crap out of cars.
Right. And you couldn't just like not let him sell your cars because that would like hurt your bottom line.
Yeah, so he was a serious guy. But they hated the fact that he was putting all these wheels and all these gadgets on it, and they were not approved by Volkswagen. And they basically threatened him. He says, if you sell these cars with all this GTV crap on it, we're pulling your franchise. So there was always this tension with them. Well, Darrell told me in that interview that I did with him about 1967, 68, he gets a phone call from Volkswagen of Germany. They want to buy the inch pincher
Wow.
for their museum.
Whoa.
That's
a turnaround right there.
I think they had Herbie, or they eventually did, and they wanted that car. And they offered him $30,000 in 1967 for that car, and he turned it down.
Oh, wow.
Can we have a inflation adjusted?
It's got to be a times 10, right?
I'm thinking a couple mil right there.
Yeah.
Wow.
And he turned it down.
Wow.
Did he say why he turned it down?
Because he hated their guts.
Oh, that was it.
Well, and he said, why should I give them my, this
Hard
is my,
work
my bullet. This is what, everybody knows Impy from this car. And so he wasn't about to give it to them. One, he didn't want to have all their secrets, that they had in it, because there was obviously a lot of engine stuff, and this front suspension, everything was different. And he just didn't want to let it go. And to sell it to them after they had threatened.
I'm so curious. This obviously is a big topic in the VW community, but does this go past that and just in the drag racing or car community? I mean, like, Dan, you were around drag racing, when you were a kid. Did you know about this car?
No, I not Volkswagen stuff. No, that wasn't on my radar.
I mean, that's such an epic story involving so many people, and with VW and Impy, who's a big company, whatever, and then the dealerships that the Vittones owned or Joe owned. This has to be a bigger story than just a VW guy. I mean, it's super intriguing.
I mean, I think to your point, that's why there's still so much like controversy to this day, because it's a far-reaching story that involves a lot of different things.
Yeah,
and I mean, it's just really cool. It's really interesting. It's kind of this like David versus Goliath sort of story that everybody kind of attaches themselves to, and I think. So it has this emotional pull to it,
Well, and David versus Goliath in a bunch of different ways. Volkswagen and the Tone. And then you got
V8s versus this tiny
the inch pincher and Cobras and whatever.
I mean, that's the whole reason why we created that little short from the podcast, because I had no idea what the inch pincher was. Honestly, I didn't even care, but I thought the story was really cool. And sure enough, it opens up this can of worms, and here we are talking about it for a second time on full. And it sounds like I'm going to be talking about this again on another show, because this story seems to just keep going on and on and on.
If there were two identical inch pinchers,
CJ.
There we go. We got to have a whole new show just to talk about that one.
So at one point at the Winter Nationals, I think this was 1974, and in Modified Eliminator, the Volkswagens raced against Hemi cars and faster cars with this handicap. Well, the final in Modified Eliminator in front of 50,000 people. ABC Wild World Sports is there. A Volkswagen, a street Volkswagen, Dave Andrews, which is Darrell Vittone's partner, against Butch Leal, which is a factory Hemi-sponsored car with millions of dollars behind it. And Dave leaves, gets the head start. People people are standing up, cheering and everything. The Hemi car red lights in the final.
Oh.
Wah, wah.
And so and the picture, some of the pictures you see, all the cameras and all the attention is on Butch Leal, because they figured, it's a shoe-in, he's going to smoke this Volkswagen, and all the photographers are shooting, and here's this Volkswagen takes off, and then he red lights, and then everybody realized Dave just won this thing. So Dave won like $6,000, and the Hemi guys are just pissed. And so then the phone call starts happening Monday morning. You got beat by a Volkswagen. Do I understand that right? And so the question is, it says, well, how much is Volkswagen paying you guys? Nothing. Volkswagen never spent one dime to support a Volkswagen drag racer, even though they were getting that kind of exposure at the ABC Werewolves.
Probably sold a ton of cars.
Well, that's just insane.
They probably sold a ton of cars from that.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely would not give us a dime.
Wow.
That's
crazy.
So all this
short-sightedness.
But you back up once again. So my buddy, they kind of got me on this whole thing. Like, I think he he obviously felt like this story was important, and he revered Dean Lowry more than anyone ever in the the car tuning community or whatever. And I think here we are talking about this story, and it's clear that what this car accomplished and what Darrell Vittone and Joe Vittone and Dean Lowry accomplished is really, I think it's kind of unprecedented in the whole history of racing.
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool, and it's just kind of this singular moment that I feel like would never really be able to be repeated again. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think Joe Vittone had the foresight, owning both the Economotors and EMPI, the value of marketing this car and putting it out in front of people and the racing aspect. So, he had Dean Lowry on salary full time, basically just working on that car.
Like R&D and stuff.
R&Ding.
Yes.
Full time. And Dean loved it. He didn't have to work on customers' cars. All he had to do was concentrate on that and taking it to the race. And so, those images and the effect that it's had over the years, there's so many people I've talked to that have been in Volkswagens for years, and that car made a big impression on them to this day. Wow. So Joe was...
How many do you know? I mean, I'm sure there's a million, but like of the actual really pure like replicas have been made? Because I know like that museum in Japan, Flat 4 has a couple, I believe.
They built a Inch Pincher 2 replica, the chop top with the Molly type paint job. They have that. They have the real Inch Pincher 3, which is a split window car that came out of New York. Richard Gurney raced that. And so that is the real car. That's not a clone. That's the real car. And they have that car as well. There was a dragster, a very small little dragster that EMPI ran for a number of years, and they have that. Mm-hmm. So, and then they had a slalom car at the Bug-Ins at Orange County in the 80s. They had drag racing and they had the car show and the swap meet, but they also had a slalom. Well, one of the salesmen at Economotors drove this car, and they had a slalom car, and that car is in Japan as well.
And then what about this car? And I don't know if Robert Keller will listen to this, but he's the current president of EMPI, and he's an acquaintance of mine, and he knows Dean. Because I didn't really follow this story, because they just released. Is it the Inch Pincher 4? What is it?
That car was built in England a few years ago because it's right-hand drive.
Oh, okay.
And so it was just a private party building it's a replica, but it's a little custom, and they ended up buying it. And
so the actual EMPI company now owns this car.
Yes. Yeah, so it was a car that somebody built in England a few years back, and they were going to build their own car. And then they saw this. I think they decided, this is so close, we'll just use this. So that's been on tour. It was at the European Bug-In in Belgium, and now it's here in Anaheim.
Well,
cool.
Maybe we can get this is Inch Pincher 1.
Well, so
we can get the Inch Pincher 2 show, and maybe we can get Robert on here to talk about more of the developing MP Inch Pincher story.
Yeah. Well, another thing that happened was MP, because like I said, Dean Lowry was doing R&D. They created all these amazing parts. They kind of like invented this kind of aftermarket market for VWs, and but then my understanding is they kind of lost all of their credibility because they took all their U.S. manufacturing and put it overseas, I think, eventually.
No, I wouldn't say that. During that period of time, a lot of their parts were made in Japan. And while we may have poo-pooed it back then, looking back at it, those parts were actually pretty darn good.
Right.
So I think that where you saw EMPI changing is when Filter Dynamics bought them.
Oh, right.
And so when that happened, that's when they said, we're deleting these parts. We're not making these. We're not making this. We're not making, but we do want all the tchotchke stuff that's hanging on the wall that people can just pull off and sell in the big box stores, is what we call them today. And I think that's when the demise started, is that a lot of the hardcore parts that made them famous got deleted.
Well, it sounds like business decision versus racing.
Absolutely.
And that was what it came down to.
But I will say Robert Keller, he's the coolest guy, and he kind of is tasked with this idea of bringing back the EMPI name and kind of bringing it back to its former glory.
There's a story right there. We should definitely have.
Well,
Robert
and he's
on
doing an
about
amazing job. Like, for instance,
Yes.
he came to see the car. I reached out to him when this whole thing happened, and I was helping liquidate this entire collection of parts and everything. And so I'm trying to manage this car. And so I reached out to him. I was like, well, I think EMPI would be interested in this car because it was, what made them famous, And so he came and checked it out. He was really cool. And but he told me about this project where basically he was trying to like I said, reinvigorate the MP name and kind of bring back the legendary kind of parts that they used to make and make them in the U.S. And so he actually wanted to buy, I guess it's copper, I guess, or it's a Hirsch shifter. It was a
yes, it's a Hirsch shifter, but it was copper coated. It had kind of a patina,
Yes.
but it was copper, and they just released that.
But we had an original one there,
Yeah.
and he's like, man, when the company was sold, they got rid of the entire catalog of parts. So he's like, I'm the president of this company, I don't even have these parts. Like, there's all these parts we know we made, I've never even seen them. And he's like, whoa, he's looking at the shop, and he was there, a couple months into it. We had sold so much of the stuff that he would have wanted. I mean, we sold all this amazing original MP stuff, but he was like, man, he's like, can I have this shifter? He's like, I know the guy who owns Hearst, and we're going to try to do a collaboration. He's like, I'm going to remake this shifter right here. It was sitting in a
That's cool.
display case in his office.
Does he believe Blaze's story?
Well, no, because he didn't end up buying it, because he was the president. And so I kind of gave him that story. He was very fascinated with the story. And then I kind of lost touch with him. And then I ran into him earlier this year at a, what is it? It's a show that happens at LAX where they sell like memorabilia. Like it's a. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The literature
show. I ran into him at the literature show, and that's when he told me he had bought that car in Europe or whatever. He's like, oh yeah, we ended up buying a car. He's like, you're gonna hear about it soon, But yeah, so he considered the car, and then Flat Four, they sent a guy from Japan out to see the car.
Now.
Now is his name. And they offered to buy the entire DDS collection. Which in hindsight, they probably just should have sold to him because it ended up going for nothing to people later down the line. And they were really fascinated by the story too. But they were, it was kind of a question mark in their mind. Like, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We don't feel like the evidence is strong enough for us to throw down and try to buy the car.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Right. Well, the mystery continues.
Man.
So anyway, I will just say,
I'm exhausted. I don't know about you guys.
An ad, but I'm just saying this car exists in Santa Barbara and is for sale currently. And so if anybody actually is interested and wants to see this car, it can be seen and can be purchased if anyone cares.
So I'm curious, a car with all this going on, what would it sell for? Is there? I mean, there's no comp.
idea.
I mean,
No
how do you
idea.
put it? How do you figure out?
I think that's a
comp
whole
on-
show just on that, man. I mean,
Yeah.
because anybody who actually cares about the story, which as the analytics prove that there are people that care about this story
clearly, yes.
passionately.
Right.
You got to find it depends on who you're going to talk to.
Exactly.
You talk to me, I'm like, I wouldn't buy it for $10.
Yeah.
But there's a guy that's like, I might spend thousands of dollars on it because the story behind it, and that's really why you would buy a car like that.
Well, I guess you could rate it by what does an oval window go for?
Yeah.
What does a modified oval window go for? What does a modified oval window with all these rare parts on it that are very sought after go for? What does, and what is a car that has, like those etched windows? Like, it might be the only car in the world that has that. So there's a lot of things about it that, I always felt like because I have a relationship with the family and I've tried to, help them manage all of these parts and that sort of thing. And I was like, yeah, you just kind of have to find the right person who is going to really be
Somebody's
emotionally
going to walk
attached to
in and
this
go,
car.
oh man, I got to have
Well,
it.
Yeah,
and they're out there.
yeah.
We've seen
Oh, yeah.
they're out there
Yep.
for sure.
Right,
That's
right.
the surprising part that we found out. Is like, wow, there is a huge following of this car and the story. Just the story in general,
Totally,
right? So
totally.
there might be somebody out there that.
So anyway, I think I seriously, it's so fun to talk to you, Dean. Thank you so much for being here. It's awesome. I know it's not my show. I'm acting like it's my show. So apologies. Apologies.
You just took the words out of my mouth. I'm so appreciative that you came here today and tried to clear the air best you could.
Yep.
And bringing the door, that was a nice touch.
So
Yes.
cool.
That is so cool that we're sitting there. I have to go afterward. Everybody talks about how light it was. I haven't tried to pick it up yet. But
There's not much to it, but
pretty light.
I think the Schley brothers are they're the ones that have the most history that they've been able to keep in their museum.
we thank them as well.
And they have unbelievable with the stuff that they have, and they have the lightning bug, the real lightning bug. The first car in the first VW in the 10s.
And this is open to the public, right? Can the public go in?
It's at Paul's house, and so you just have to arrange it.
Okay.
Because they do private tours. You could get the 2-hour tour, you could get the 6-hour tour, depending upon how Mark feels and how wordy he is. But there's no other place that I've been to that has the history of Volkswagen drag racing like that anywhere in the world.
Oh wow!
And I've been able to add to it and get some interesting things to it, but it's kind of my Disneyland. I go there quite a bit just because of the environment is so cool.
Well, I love it.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? You guys? Do you guys want to start more trouble, Peter?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Now we got to
Isn't
bring.
that funny how that one little comment started all this?
Well, and it's
love it.
funny. Like, I'll just be totally candid with you guys. I was like talking, and I was looking at you. I was like, I think they think I'm going too long in this show right now. I shouldn't tell this story.
No.
But I was like, I'm already like into this story, so I'm going to tell it real quick. And I like tried to make it very brief. And it's funny that ended up like having this huge effect.
You just never know. I mean, I didn't think anything of it, but I just thought it was a cool story.
Yeah.
I still think the story is cool because there's so much more that you could talk about. Like Richard Keller, right?
Robert Keller.
Richard Keller.
Richard, I was about to say, we'll have him on because he's a Keller. He's a relative.
But I'm, just the fact that he's carrying on this MP name. The MP name is famous because of this car, right?
And wouldn't you say they're sponsoring drags again, right? MP.
They're sponsoring a lot of events all over the world. They're doing the European Bug-In, and so their 50th anniversary is coming up in 26, and so I think you're going to see a lot of stuff from MP from them. But yeah, they're a major sponsor of a lot of events,
which is so cool because I think, like, from my understanding, the kind of whole VW drag racing thing kind of fell out of, it wasn't really popular, and so it's cool that they're like, Robert in that whole crew is trying to kind of bring back the glory days, which is a really cool thing.
That's the story that I think it was worth covering too. Some manufacturers getting back into it, sponsoring and helping the guys get the sport going. So maybe we'll have that show soon.
Absolutely.
So
and he's a Keller.
Well, he's local too. He lives like in the county. So
perfect. Does he really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I wonder if he's related. Richard Keller's who created all of this and west of Tulsa.
Oh my gosh, that would be a wild.
We wonder if it's like a relative, some distant relative from west of Tulsa.
That would be wild.
All right, Dean, thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, Peter, thank you for coming back.
For sure.
And for everybody trying to clear this thing up, did we make progress? We'll find out on social media, right? We'll find out what everybody has to say.
Make sure you comment.
About this. That's right.
Comment.
All right, don't forget, you want something that we want to talk about, go to our website, westofTulsa.com, click on the, what's it called?
Tip line.
Tip line.
It's okay.
We were going to change the name at some point, and now you guys have fucked me up.
We're not
because I can't even
changing
remember the name of it
anything.
anymore. All right. So, and then don't forget the like, follow, subscribe, and we have our YouTube
channel.
All right. All right. Thanks for watching, listening, whatever you do, and we will see you west of Tulsa.